Good morning. We're live. It says Tuesdays with Kamira, and it's Thursday. We had a swap week, Sue and I. So I'm having Tuesdays with Kamira on Thursday with you. Thank you for joining us. We're here today with Ericka Smith. Thank you, Ericka, for joining us
Thank you
today.
for having me.
Ericka is going to talk to us about something very important. If you have a teen or a tween who you think has a learning difference, you're probably berating yourself right now thinking, I should have caught this earlier. I should have caught this in elementary school or in preschool. I need you to stop that right now. Stop that thinking, because there are loads of reasons why now is the relevant time for you to act upon this. There are reasons why you didn't understand it before. And what's important is for you to figure out the next steps now if you think that your tween or teen may have a learning difference. And Ericka is here to walk us through that. Ericka knows from personal experience and from activist experience what it is that families need to do once they think, oh, my child may have a learning difference. I'm not sure. What do I do? And if they do, what could the difference be? Mom Ericka has been there. She's going to share her family story with us. But before she does that, a couple of housekeeping things. She will answer our questions live on air. So if you have questions or comments, just please put them in the comment section and Ericka will answer them. If you are joining us live on Thursday, the 9th, December 9th at 10:30 a.m., she will do that Eastern time. If you are joining us at any other time, Ericka will not be available to answer your questions and comments. But you should feel free to dialogue with other people in the comment section of this posting, because people do that all the time and people learn from each other, encourage each other. So I would like you to do that if you feel so inclined. Good morning, Ericka. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, let's start with you telling us a little bit about yourself, and then let's use your family's story to illustrate how a parent may suspect that their child has a learning difference, and then what happens from there.
Okay. Well, it seems like such a long journey. So I have a younger son who is dyslexic, and he was classic, where he would write backwards, spell backwards, and was having difficulty reading. So that was one of those situations where I knew something wasn't right, and I just began to Google search. And as I was Googling, we've heard about dyslexia, but didn't really know what that means. I think that we tend to think that it's letters floating, or everybody writes backwards, but that simply isn't the case. I got him an educational psychological evaluation. And when I did that, it was basically a learning profile. And it just told me everything, that it wasn't just dyslexia, it was dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, working memory issues, as well as ADHD and processing issues. So just a gamut of things. From there, I was then recommended to go to an occupational therapist. And I did not know, I'm thinking occupational therapists are for when people are recovering from strokes or something, but it's not. You're not able to read if you're not able to cross over your midline, right? And so he began going to occupational therapy. I began seeking out schools for him, tutors, etc. So fast forward, because we're talking about teens here. I just became very involved in the learning disability, learning difference community. And I began to go to conferences and workshops and participate in different webinars and things. And I started seeing, I had an older son who at this time is still in elementary, but he is older, and things that he had issues with, comprehension issues. And I was told before, oh, do a whisper phone so he can hear what he's saying and read to himself. And so it's all these things. But as I'm going and I'm engaging in these different seminars, I'm thinking, well, my younger son doesn't have this issue, but my older son has this issue, right? And what we know is it's genetic. And some of these issues I've had. I always had a comprehension issue. And so from there, I decided, and at this point, I believe he was at middle school, because it took a few years to get it all together, right? To get him an educational psychological evaluation and see, okay, where are his deficits and what are there. And what he came up with is he is not dyslexic. What I do know is that dyslexia shows in many forms, right? Lack of subject-verb agreement, lack of using helping verbs. It's just a whole lot that we just don't think of in every day. So my older son came out not to be dyslexic, but still have some learning deficits. And so at this point, he's older. And when you're older, of course, as a child, you're not as receptive. You don't want the extended time on the test because you don't want kids to think that you're different, right? Even though you can get this. You don't want to use a whisper phone because you don't want to use any of those accommodations. Yes.
What can you define whisper phone for us?
Yes. So whisper phone, and I wish I had one with me right here. You can even make one yourself out of pipe, right, from Home Depot. And you put it to your ear. And it's like the telephone game, but you hear yourself. So if your auditory is extremely high, which my children have extremely high auditory, you're going to read the story to yourself aloud, like if you're having silent reading, and it's going to come back to you as if somebody else was reading that story. And so that helps with the comprehension piece of it, right? If you have high auditory. And so that's just one of those modifications that your child can have in a report, one of the tools that they can use in a classroom if they're permitted to. This is why I always suggest an educational psychological evaluation, because now you say, okay, this is the best practice for my child.
Now, and how do we go about getting that evaluation? What is the first step? Okay, I suspect something. I get to get an evaluation. Where do I go? Who does this?
Okay, so a couple things. Psychologists do them. So, and they're very expensive, and you can also have a neuropsychologist do them. And there's a lot of different resources to find them. International Dyslexia Association has a list of psychologists. Of course, again, Google, we can always Google and find them. For me, I'm a big Facebook group person. So I like to go into the local Facebook groups and ask parents what their experiences were, et cetera, prior to actually, because again, it's a lot of money. Rendering the services from the psychologist. They are expensive. Now, CHOA and I'm sure other children's hospitals also offer this. You can go to them and see if you can get an evaluation. And a lot of times they have residences and things that are going to also offer the same service at a fraction of the cost. And overall, you are seeing something in your child, you go to your school and you tell your school, hey, I'd like to get testing for my child because I'm seeing these things. Now, that's a little bit more of a fight, and you might have to get an advocate for that to actually get the testing service. But your child is given the right to have accommodations and services. It is a civil right. So if your child is struggling and you think they're struggling, you need to go to the school and talk to the school. You can also talk to your pediatrician about it and see who your pediatrician recommends. Again, you'd be seeing a psychologist or a neuropsychologist, but just from a financial aspect, can that pediatrician recommend you to someone?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Okay, so let's continue with your family story. Thanks for that.
So with my older son, we began to get him the extra time on his test and just work with him. So there's things that you do with an ADHD brain and that are good practices for everybody, but we make lists, right? And it's a checklist, and you follow that checklist. And so what you're doing is you're retraining the brain. So I think oftentimes we think, and myself included, is, why are you not listening? You know, I just told you to do X, Y, and Z. But if you have working memory issues, you need everything step by step by step. It can't be even, get your homework, did you get your jacket, where's your laptop, eat your breakfast. It's a lot to take on. So it had to be step by step by step by step by step. Did you get your jacket? Check. Have you eaten your breakfast? Check. Do you have your laptop? Check. So you're retraining your brain to do that. And these are good practices for everybody, myself included, as a person who forgot their laptop this morning. That we're using these things and we're following these steps, because what happens is, if they forget something or they get to school and their laptop's not charged, and now the teacher is now saying, why is your laptop not charged? You can't do your work. Well, that just sends up their anxiety, right? And so that high anxiety is going to affect your academics, especially for an ADHD child. It's going to be, your day's just going to be kind of shot. So making sure that we're following these processes and these procedures every day, all day. Same thing with classrooms, that you're using a checklist, and that every single day. And I know everybody loves all this Google Classroom now and all these portals now and all of that. But what we know is pen to paper stays in your brain better. so that you have your child with a checklist and they're writing it down and they're checking it off, then the teacher's checking it off.
Mhm.
And that way, when they come home, they know what they have to do. Yes, you can log into a portal. Absolutely. Yes, it's in your Google Classroom. But for certain children, like my children, they need to write that down. They need those good old fashioned calendars from the 80s where you write things down and you check off and the teacher checks off.
Yeah.
So little strategies like that, because again, when your child is older, they're more cognitive of what's going on around them, and it's going to affect their self-esteem. So they need to make sure all their I's are dotted, all their T's are crossed. So when they get into class, they're fully prepared and they're able to woo-saw and just hone in on what is being taught.
Great. So one of the things that you mentioned is one of my tips that works for me is the writing, right? Because our brains work differently when we write than they do when we type. So I do both. And I think that we should encourage our kids to do both. If you write it and then at the end of the day or the end of the shift or class, whatever it is, then you type it, you start to notice, if you pay attention, that you're thinking different things at both points. It also helps with studying because now you've reviewed the material 3 times. You've heard it from the teacher, you've written it down, and you've typed it.
Absolutely.
So that's 3 times. So thank you for that. That works for me in my old brain.
Well, I say that. And then a child with an ADHD brain, it's like 700 channels going off, right?
Mhm.
And so what we know is that they are extremely smart, extremely bright. And that's something you hear a lot. Well, they didn't finish their assignment, and I know they can do it because they're very bright. I know they can do it because they're very smart. And it's not that they're not very smart or they're not very bright. It's they can do it. But if your brain is blocked because of other things and you have so many thoughts going on here, it's hard to produce.
Yeah.
So it's really important. And what I've learned is, and it's huge now with the science of reading, is what is good for best practices for a dyslexic child, best practices across the board. So that's also going to help the child that has working memory issues. That's also going to help the child that has ADHD issues, following the science of reading. And so a lot of times, and I think since, especially now, children weren't getting recess as much anymore. And so we're always looking for these outlets, right? We're looking for our children to be able to do things because they're tactile, and all those things are great. But we also have to go back to the basics. You have to go back to the science of reading. We have to go back to the rules of spelling. I always say I before E, except after C. We learn that. And those are things that we keep in our brain. But a lot of times today, that's not the methodology that's being taught. And so with that child, with that learning difference, they're going to need to be in an environment that has structured literacy. 1, 2, 3. And so if there's gaps, for my older son, there was gaps in this. And so we went back and began to remediate him through the Barton system, which uses Orton-Gillingham, which is Orton-Gillingham base. And so that was, we're going to take you all the way back to 1st grade. And my son just thought that was the end of the world. The first thing he says to me is, "This is all so easy." And I'm like, "It's easy now." But they needed to see what it was you were missing. What were you missing? Phonological awareness at some point. And then as he began to go through it, it became more difficult. Because although it seems simple, if you've missed something in those foundation years, you can't build upon, you need to be able to build upon your knowledge, right? And so a big thing is, even now in high school, that you're learning these Latin roots. Because once you learn those Latin roots, you'll be able to spell so many more things. You'll be able to know so many more words. You can figure that out. So it's just going back to the basics. So with your high school student, because now he's in high school, with your high school student, it's really, really important that you're working on Latin roots. Even if you're not using a tutor, you're pulling those Latin roots yourself. And now again, we love the internet. There, you can always Google, and they have people that have YouTubes where they're breaking down different words. And that's extremely, extremely, extremely helpful. But I think the biggest thing with older children is the confidence. They've got to feel, that they can do the work, and they've got to be confident enough to say, "Hey, I get extended time on a test." Sometimes you got to remind a teacher, or, "Excuse me, I'm supposed to get this test orally." And you have to remind them. And it also might cause for a little inconvenience, right? So it might be a situation where you have to stay in on lunch to take the test. And that's something that's just not a social day for you. And I think that's a lot of times that's difficult for high school students because they see it as a punishment, but it's not a punishment by any means. It's just you're needing it's a different style. And I know one thing people say is, well, what's the difference between learning disabilities and learning differences?
Yeah.
Well, we we call it the LD community, we say learning differences because it's simply a different way of learning, right? It's not, it's just that it's different and you just need to be taught a little differently. But now when you start talking about legally, it's disabilities. And so you're trying to get your child a 504, if you're trying to get your child an IEP, if you're trying to get SSI to help you offset some of these costs, it is a learning disability. But we just like to call it differences.
So let's go back and talk about the process if you're trying to do these things.
Oh, yes.
So you said that a good tip is for people to check out, go through your pediatrician, but also check out your local children's hospital if you're looking to get an evaluation because you suspect that your child has a learning difference, or if you're talking to the government, a disability,
Yes.
so that you can get access to whatever it is that
Exactly.
civil rights to have access
Yeah.
to. The vast majority of people are probably going to start with the school. So what do you do now? You suspect this, your child is anywhere from middle school to somewhere in high school. Who do we go to at the school? What are we saying to them? Because they may know less than we do, depending
Right.
on which school all schools aren't created equal.
No, you're absolutely correct. And so a lot of that you're absolutely correct. And so I think you start with your school counselor, right? And you talk to your school counselor about some things you're seeing. And sometimes if your child has good, you see it in your child, but your child still has good grades, it makes it a little more difficult to get that child assessed. So I think you talk to the counselor, you bring up your concerns, and then you just begin to really push them and say, my child needs this assessment, because it will be a school psychologist that gives the assessment. And then even in that, you need to ask, typically, what do you include in your IEPs? What support services do you have? What can you offer? And what is the training of some of these teachers or these people? Is that classroom inclusive? Or do they have a pull-out program? How does all of that work? And if you need an advocate, because often people need advocates, you need to contact the National Council for Learning Disabilities. I also strongly recommend following them on social media, subscribing to their email list, because what they have is they have quarterly webinars now. And I guess eventually one day in life will be in person again, but they have webinars and they bring in different speakers and experts to talk to you about the process, right? And this is something that's in several states. So county to county things differ. So it's good. Again, I'm really big on parent to parent. So it's good to get on calls like that. And then you'll have a parent, might be from your county, that asks the question. You say, oh, I have that same question too. And then somebody else on the council can assist you in that.
Okay.
So I think it's really good to do that, as well as get into the Facebook groups. As crazy again as social media is, there's always someone in there that's gone through what you're going through. And they can help you to maneuver the process, because the process is always not that easy, especially when we're dealing with my getting tongue tied, but invisible learning differences. And I think that historically we've thought that the bright child, right, is the child that's simply not trying. But what we know, and the more we know now as we study the science of the brain, is that's not true. It's either environmental or it's neurological. So it's in your brain or it's in your environment. So either way, you need the same methodology.
So another quick tip that just came from, I have virtue of doing these talks and the times that we're living in, a lot of parents have been coming to me seeking resources from different parts of the country, because there are families in crisis all different kinds of ways, including trying to have children assessed for different things. In your community, there may be a clinic that has sliding scale fees. So do not sleep on those, because they have wonderful professionals of all types. Sometimes when we're thinking of assessing neurological things or psychological things, we don't go to those because we think of them as physical health, but they have those other departments too. So think of that too, because as Ericka said, this can be very expensive. So we've started with the school. You say go to the counselor. They should be able to assess or to send you someplace. Then and then you mentioned maybe 2 breaks ago about that this is you have civil rights in this area, you have a learning disability. What does that give you the right to? You name some things like IEP and 504. What are those things, and what do we have the rights to, and what do they mean for students that have now been diagnosed with something?
Okay. So let me just for clarity, is the school counselor cannot diagnose you. It has to
Okay.
come from a psychologist, but the
Okay.
school counselor can recommend you to the people in the
Okay.
school, within the school district.
Okay.
And teachers cannot diagnose you. I know that a myth people say, and a lot of times people don't like the diagnosis because of the labeling piece, and the teachers said my child had ADHD, and the teachers can't say that. The teachers don't say that. So
Mhm.
it's a situation where we're noticing a pattern here, something's going on, and then a school counselor can then recommend that you go see a school psychologist or the principal or whomever. But that it has to come from a medical professional
Okay.
because it is a medical diagnosis.
And you just said something that's very helpful to parents. When you're trying to communicate with your school, say that you've noticed a pattern. That's a key word to and phrase, right?
Absolutely. And document
Okay.
everything.
So
And so
now you have your documents, you've talked to the counselor. What's next?
So if the school gives you the psychological evaluation, then you can look at the assessment after that and proceed. Then that's when you can move on to a 504 or an IEP. And
Mhm.
an IEP is an individual education plan.
Mhm.
And that IEP, you would also have an SST, which is student support staff team. And you'd all meet together and say, what are the needs of this child? What accommodations does this child need? Right. And I'm really big on advocates, and I'm really big on reading, because you want to make sure that that IEP is written to really support your child.
Mhm.
If your child, beyond just additional time on tests, that's something you hear a lot. That's
Mhm.
fine. You want to say, if that child again is auditory, like I explained about my son, can you give them test orally?
Mhm.
And if so, that needs to be written in the plan. If it's a thing with spelling words per se, does that child, everybody else gets 20 words, my child needs 10 words.
Okay.
The older you get in its papers, if everyone else is writing 5 paragraphs, my child needs 3 paragraphs. Or if everyone else's is due on the 10th, my child needs theirs to be due on the 15th. Things like that. Just it's the details.
Mhm.
So you're getting the correct support services. Because I know a lot of people are very against getting their children diagnosis, letting the school know, and then because they're into the labeling. But I always say, you don't want your child to struggle, because either way they're struggling. Right.
Mhm.
So just because they don't have the documentation doesn't mean that they're not struggling. They're still struggling. It's still challenging for them.
Mhm.
And so one of the analogies we use all the time is, if someone's in a wheelchair, they have to have a handicap ramp. And you
Mhm.
would never say, oh, they don't need that ramp. So we have to look at it the same way.
Yeah.
If your child is having challenges, academic challenges, but there's something that can support them in that, then you want to make sure that they're getting that support. Because once they receive that support, they're going to be extremely successful. And again, it goes back to confidence. And then their confidence will be up, and they'll be able to do anything they want. I mean, we hear a lot now about all of the famous people. Now people are talking more and more about their learning disabilities. But what
Mhm.
they all have in common is that they struggled in school. They struggled in school.
Mhm.
And you have those that are really successful. You have your Bill Gates, and you have all of those people. Governor Newsom yesterday was speaking. He just wrote a book on his dyslexia.
Yes.
And those people are successful. But for all those success stories, we have a ton of people that have given up. The
Yes.
prisons are full. I mean, we say that 20% of the population has a learning or attention issue, but that accounts for about 55% of the prison population.
Mhm.
And I haven't been able to find a national study, but this was a study done out of Texas, and they found that 55% of the prison population had a learning and attention issue, and it's only 20% in the world. So you have all these people that have fallen through the cracks, and a lot of times they're brilliant, right? And
Mhm.
you know that, and then teachers will say, oh, he was really smart, but if he didn't fit into that school environment, then maybe he went out and started robbing people, or he found his own
Yeah.
way illegally to make money and do things. And so that is a huge issue for me. That's near and dear to my heart, that we're getting these children the support that they need, that they're getting the confidence so they can just get through school and do something else in life, whether it's going on to college, whether it's going on to trade school, where it's going on to a business or whatever it is. They have to have that confidence to believe in themselves that they can do it. Because without that confidence, they're going to think that they're worthless. And then that's where you start to see people getting into trouble and doing different things. Just Amir Baraka speaks on this. Like by the time he was in the 3rd grade, he said that he knew he was going to start selling drugs because he would take those spelling tests home and he wouldn't get any of them right. And so he knew he was going to get in trouble. And so what he saw around him, successful people were doing illegal things. So by the time he's in the 6th grade, he's like, oh, well, I'll sell drugs too, because you're feeling like this is the only way. But with proper diagnosis and support, you could have a different route, because you would know, oh, okay, even if it's just, even if you're not using the term, right? Just receiving the support. Because some states and school districts still don't use certain terminology surrounding learning disabilities. But just knowing and getting that confidence to say, okay, I learn differently. And that's why we go back to different instead of disabilities. Oh, I learn differently. And this is what I need to get me to where I need to go. It's just embracing that.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to put up a comment. Mm-hmm. Christina says she just ordered Governor Newsom's book, which is, I saw him on TV promoting it. It looks like it's good. I hope you enjoy it, Christina. Thanks for the comment. If you have a question or comment, now is the time to put it up, because we are coming to the end of our time. You should take advantage of speaking with Ericka, because not only has she had this experience with her own family, she has become an activist. She has founded an organization, Define Me, Transcending Learning Differences, and she also works at a school that specializes in working with children with learning differences. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Oh, but before you do that, Evangeline has a comment. Let's see what it is. She says, my daughter, not diagnosed on the autism spectrum until she was 17. We tried to get her tested for what she saw as processing delay as early as elementary school. That is a long time for a family to really weed through the system to try to get someone tested from elementary school till the age of 17. I hope everything is going okay, Evangeline. Do you have any, Ericka, do you have any advice for families who may be in a similar situation so that they don't have to have as long as a delayed process?
Yes, get an advocate. You know, that's from elementary to 17, that's a long time. And so that's when, unfortunately, you've got to bring in an advocate. And somebody that can just really help and really push the school district to get your child tested. And perhaps even, again, going to your local children's hospital and seeing what they have on a sliding scale, as well as sometimes stuff is pro bono, you know, they'll do it. I know even with some speech and language pathologists, it's just very hard to maneuver the system and figure out who these people are. And that's why I suggest getting into every social media group you can get into, because other parents know this. You know, a lot of times when you go to a website, they don't have the information, but someone will say, oh, this practice, this SLP practice over here, they take a few students that are not able to afford the services. And that's just something they give back and they do. Right. And so, again, I think like the National Council of Learning Disabilities, attending their webinar, reaching out to them, asking questions, because there's things that we cannot find that are just not readily, I don't want to say readily available, is not probably the correct term, but that are just not advertised that this service can be given to you for free. Because you don't know, right? You don't know with occupational therapy that there's a therapist in there that is saying, okay, I'll take 2 clients on for free of charge because I believe in this.
And you have another comment. Okay. So what you're saying is build community. It's important to build community because this information is not readily available. So you're going to be dependent upon other people who've been there or in the midst of it with you. Yes. Dana says she has an inattentive ADHD 16-year-old and found through this with her school. School counselor hasn't been much help because she performs well on tests in school, but can't manage daily assignments. The 504 helps, but that is all we have. She's in AP and pre-AP classes and struggling. Do you have any advice for Dana?
I mean, I think it's the same thing. Maybe, Dana, if you're able to get an advocate, and even, I mean, I even hate to say this, but an education attorney to get those accommodations for your daughter. I have a son that struggles in the same way. It's hard to manage daily assignments, and they tend to think if your child is bright, they're just doing it because they don't want to. They're not doing the work because they don't want to do it. They're just doing this because this is what they want to do. And that's simply not the case. And so it just, to me, comes in forms of you having to really push for your child, which I'm sure you've been doing, and then maybe reading different books, looking at different YouTube channels, and coming up with strategies that you can do in the home to get the daily assignments done. Whether it be, I don't know what your schedule is like, but every day when your child comes home saying, okay, what was that assignment? Let's go over that assignment. That's like something I have to do. And it's to be quite honest, it's exhausting. But I know that if I don't say, what was that assignment? Let me see where you wrote the assignment. And let me see the Google Classroom. Let's go. That assignment's not going to get done. And that's just part of the ADHD brain.
Well, I want to talk about two things before we go. Okay. First one is, you've mentioned that families need advocates, and you mentioned that they may be able to find one at their local children's hospital, or maybe through their pediatrician. Where are some other places that someone can go? Perhaps some of these organizations, if you can repeat the names for people who are taking notes, where they can go to find advocates, or even to find information on how to research advocates.
So Learning Disability Association of America.
Learning Disability Association of America.
I would also go to the ADA State Department. The ADA State Department should have some information on
Americans with Disabilities Act, your State Department of American with Disabilities Act.
And National Council of Learning Disabilities.
Okay.
Should be able to point you in the right direction.
Okay.
I would suggest, just kind of for a boost for all parents, that you listen to Dr. Sean Anthony Robinson's TED Talk. Also,
Sean Anthony Robinson, SEAN or
SHAWN.
Okay.
Sean Anthony Robinson. He has a TED Talk that's phenomenal. He was in special ed his whole life and still couldn't read, and now he's a PhD and he's written books. Dr. Dyslexia, he's awesome. I would also suggest reading Mindful Parenting by Dr. Mark Burton. And also Laderick Horn. He does a lot of, also a dyslexic, does a lot of, not TED Talks, but a lot of Zooms, a lot of webinars.
And his first name is?
Laderick Horn.
Okay. So we are going to put these in the comment section. If they're not up immediately, we'll put them up afterwards. I'll literally listen to this again and make sure that we input all of those in the comment section. So if we're missing any, just check back and they'll be up there. But most of them are coming up now.
So my nonprofit, I know we're wrapping up here, is I define me transcending learning differences. And basically is why I say transcending learning differences is to change the way we look at it. And a lot of the questions people are asking me now, I wish that I can point you to the exact person. So what my overall goal is, my younger son wrote a book called I Define Me. And it was basically taken from little snippets where he was writing, talking about his dyslexia and Winnie the Pooh's dyslexia and all these things. And we put it in a book. But from there, we began talking with people and advocating for SB 48, which here in Georgia is this screening for all children to be screened for dyslexia by first grade. And what we know is that, again, it's not that they might be dyslexic, but what screening you would do for them would also indicate other learning disabilities, other learning issues. So as we began to do that, people began to ask questions, right? And I'm like, gosh, we want to just be a resource to people. So I gradually, because I'm a one-man show, I gradually on my website have started putting recommendations for psychologists and things. But I eventually, and I'm not there yet, want to have something where you can go right on there and find an advocate instead of searching in all these places, right, for that advocate. Where you can go on there and I can say, like the woman that was saying her daughter's 16 with the ADHD, but in AP classes, that you can go on there and somebody can say to you, okay, this is exactly how we did it in this state.
Exactly.
And so because the main thing is, and I feel like I'm losing time here, but with my family story, is you spend so much time trying to figure out, and we're losing time. And as we lose time, our kids are losing confidence.
Yes.
But if we can just go to a central place and say, okay, here it is, and this is the blueprint, and pass that blueprint on, it would just be wonderful. You know, it would be wonderful, because all these are the stories that I hear through being on the National Council for Learning Disabilities over and over and over again, is that older children, the parents saw stuff, they pushed to get their children diagnosed, and they just simply weren't able to do it, or until they were much older, or that their IEPs or their 504s are not supporting the child in the way that they should support the child. Right. And then the big one, us as parents, we have to understand that it's okay for our children to be diagnosed. I think that's the first stop when you're apprehensive. And so you might see something when they're young and you say, oh no, because I don't want them to be labeled.
Yes.
You know? And then knowing that, I mean, the ADHD brain, you're brilliant, right? They're brilliant people. These are their billionaires, but it doesn't mean that they don't have challenges in other areas. So getting them that support.
Evangeline has asked something that I wanted to make sure. She is the daughter who's a senior. She says, any suggestions for college resources? I'll wrap that up with my college question, because we are talking tweens to teens. What questions should the students with learning differences be asking during the college search process? So before they get to college, and then after they get to college.
Bestcolleges.com has a whole guide for schools, as well as learning guides for children once they're in college. Because what you hear is that only 11% of the children, once they get into college, even report that they have a learning disability. And you are able to get these accommodations. And so you were asking, once they're in college, what they should do. They should go to the resource department. I mean, ask this prior to starting schools, but most schools have resource departments, and most schools support the 504. Okay. And so you want to make sure that your child has a 504. I mean, one thing now, I have a sophomore, is that you get a 504 that they can use all the way through college. But again, it's confidence, because they've got to go back and tell the teacher, oh, don't forget, I mean, a professor, right? I have a 504. I need extended time on this test. I have a 504. I need to turn in this paper a little differently. But all the schools have resource departments. I would just look to see what school has the strongest resource department, and what school supports learning differences and disabilities. I mean, I hear that High Point in North Carolina is phenomenal for this, that they're really, really good. They do a lot of things. They have the stock rooms and all those things that are really life experiences that our children that are not neurotypical really thrive in. So, I mean, schools like that. But bestcolleges.com has a whole section on what to do once you're in college, as well as college suggestions. So I would highly, but overall confidence, you got to build that confidence, and your child has got to be able to advocate for themselves.
Okay. Christina says, so it's important to get a 504 before they leave high school. Absolutely, because they can carry it through to college. So that is something very important. And that's why you're here today. We have wrapped up our time. Every time I start with somebody, I tell them 30 minutes flies by. It seems like it's going to be a lot when I ask for 30 minutes of your time, but it flies by.
It does.
Thank you so much, Ericka. I have one last question for you. You gave us some tips, so I'm not going to ask you for a takeaway, but if there was something, knowing what you know now, what do you wish you knew earlier or had done earlier?
A lot. I just wish that that the knowledge was there, right? Because as soon as I was given that knowledge, I became a maniac. But I think that I wasn't there. It's a different movement now, because what we know is that reading scores haven't risen across America since 1992. So we're hitting 30 years. So you're seeing a lot more of that. Here in Georgia, only 46% of children read on grade level. So we're getting a little more information than we had, let's say, 10 years ago. But I tell everybody this. I just wish one person had told me, get an educational psychological evaluation. And then that would have alleviated other issues. But it just comes from the knowledge. So the more knowledge and the more we put out there, and the more we have conversations like this, parents can automatically say, hey, let me look into that. Let me look at an educational psychological evaluation. And then let me Google and see. Because when you Google now, all the things with ADHD, all these years I had a child that was struggling in different areas, and it's ADHD, and we didn't know, because we think ADHD is your child jumping off of a sofa or something. But my child had none of that. It's mainly the attention piece of it, right? And so you're not able to receive that information if your attention and your brain, and there's 700 channels going off on it.
Yeah.
You're not able to receive that information. But I would have thought, and I tell everybody personally, had anyone have even suggested to me, oh, with ADHD, I'd be like, no, my child's not running around,
Yeah.
doing these things. But that's not, it's the inattentive piece, right? And
Yeah.
so the more we learn ourselves, then the more we will be able to provide for our children, and the more we would be receptive to these different diagnoses. So I just think like the knowledge, the one thing I wish is that I knew all these terms and what the terms truly meant, and not kind of like what the Ruber meal says it is.
Yeah.
Right? So that's it.
One term you mentioned that's very important for families is, you said you're asking for an education psychological evaluation.
Yes.
Make sure that when you suspect and you go to your school counselor, that's what you're asking for, because it's possible that you have a counselor who's not quite sure what it is that you need. So you need to guide them. So it's an education psychological evaluation. And that's what you wish you had heard earlier on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even with my son in the whisper phone and stuff, nobody ever suggested that. And so you're just going around doing what you think is the best and saying, well, you should try harder, when in all actuality, they're trying harder. So I always say that with school systems and stuff, everybody wants what's best for the child. But if we don't have this knowledge, then we're not doing what's best for the child. So I don't ever think that it's the school trying to say, well, your child doesn't need this or that. It's that they don't have that knowledge and they're saying, well, they're really bright. Well, because we grew up in that, you just try harder. Well, if you just do that, well, if you hand a kid a book, they'll read. And it's just simply not the case.
Yeah. So you may have to guide them. So you will want to use the resources that we have in the comment section to help you through the process, and to maybe help for you to help your school service you through the process.
Absolutely.
Know your rights. Make sure that you read up on your rights, so that you know that you're have access to 504s and IEPs, and that these carry you through undergrad. It doesn't stop in high school. Ericka, thank you so much for joining us and giving us this.
So you can't take an IEP to college with you. So if you have an IEP, you can only take a 504 to college with you. So make sure that you're getting that 504, that you're using that IEP K through 12, and then you're getting that 504 for when you're older, and that they're learning to advocate for themselves when they get into those environments, because the reality of it is you don't overcome any of these. You just learn the strategies to deal with them.
That's a perfect place to end. I love that. Thank you so much, Ericka. Thank you, everybody who's watching this. Please join us tomorrow, Friday. Tomorrow, Friday, is when we have I'm used to being on Tuesdays, and I know who comes on Wednesdays, but tomorrow, Friday, is Sue and Steph are up, and they are discussing all kinds of things teen. They're wonderful. They are actually our founders of Your Teen for Parents magazine. So you should really come and hear them. They have all the wisdom. They've been here since day one, and they're a lot of fun. They're best friends, and they're always dishing on the fun aspects of parenting and raising teens, and sometimes the not so fun, but you got to find the humor in it. I appreciate you, Ericka. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.